Thank you so much for those introductions, Peter. Thanks all of you for being here. We're really excited to share our work with you this afternoon. We're excited to talk about this work with a new audience in particular. By way of a brief introduction, I'll just say that the three of us came to the topic of feminist energy systems through somewhat distinct, though related paths, and you'll hear some evidence of those paths in the presentation. This talk, however, and the article on which it's based represent how we came together to try to collectively imagine how energy systems could be thought about in feminist terms. So first slide. So there's an abundance of evidence, including in Google Images, where I took these three images from, that many people understand and frame energy, climate, and environmental justice as feminist issues. In many ways, this is because feminist theory and praxis offer expertise in the study of power relations. Indeed, feminists have long linked the simultaneous and compounded oppressions of gender, race, ability, sexuality, geopolitical location, and economic class, and have referred to the coexistence of these modes of oppression via the term intersectionality. Our definition and deployment of feminism here and in our individual work is thoroughly intersectional, meaning that we think about sameness and difference in terms of power. By studying gender hierarchically, feminists have also demonstrated the centrality of ordering to the operation of power, arguing that it is through the social construction and distinct valuation of categorical differences between human beings that inequality is generated. Subordinated social identities and their correspondingly uneven access to political and economic power emerge when differences are ranked. We can see how intersectional identities impact people's lived experiences by looking at the environmental justice movement in the United States, a movement founded in large part by poor Black women, many of whom lived in subsidized or other forms of community housing. These women's ability to respond to a myriad of environmental concerns, including toxic chemicals being dumped in and around their homes and endangering the lives of their families, was thoroughly shaped by several dimensions of their identities, not least of which were being poor, Black, and feminized. The wholesale devaluation of these intersectional identities limited the kinds of economic and political power they could both harness and wield. Importantly, however, these intersectional identities can also function as entry points to forms of activism, knowledge production, and refusal that have become central to contemporary climate and environmental justice movements. We see such an entry point in the work of Rihanna Gun Wright, a Black feminist activist and one of the architects of Green New Deal legislation in the United States. Gun Wright talks openly about the ways that she had previously not seen herself in US-based environmental movements that to her aligned uncomfortably with forms of whiteness. It was intersectional feminist thought, she says, that brought her around. In a 2019 interview with a Black journalist, Gun Wright further elaborates on this shift in her thinking. How many times in your life do you look up and go, this is climate change? Very few, especially if you're a person of color. But when you feel it is when your house floods and you don't have flood insurance, or when you lose your job because you are working in a coal-fired plant and now it has to be shut down, or because you or your community is moving to renewables. That's the level at which we have to communicate to people. And I think that if not for my background in Black feminism, we wouldn't have gotten to this place because we wouldn't have really understood it. Feminism then is a concept and a praxis that encompasses far more than the study of sex and gender, though the lived experiences of these two socially constructed categories have catalyzed many of our analyses of power relations. In addition to thinking critically about sex and gender, feminism theorizes freedom and liberation, practices reflexivity and accountability, enacts humility and partiality, and by this we mean acknowledging our biases as well as the incomplete nature of our knowledge, and centers collaboration, care, and repair. We hope to illuminate each of these dimensions of feminist thought throughout this presentation and to talk more about them in the Q&A session after the slides. And with that, I'll turn things over to Cara Daggett.
Thanks, Christine. This is a table from our article that summarizes the dimensions along which we analyzed what would a feminist energy system look like. And I should clarify that the article, we really thought a lot about the audience when we wrote this, and we meant it to be legible to a broader energy studies community that maybe had not yet thought in feminist terms, or maybe even had not thought in critical energy studies terms. So we picked these dimensions because it's a big task to think about what does feminist energy mean. And these seem to us to be the way that energy studies often organizes itself, or key dimensions of energy studies. And we wanted to kind of speak back to each of them. So I'm starting with the political, which we have here some key terms like democratic, pluralist, publicly owned. And we got to this by first thinking about how energy is usually discussed. And by that, I mean in mainstream policymaking circles, but also in a lot of energy studies. And that is in the realm of exchange, and very commonly price, cost of different fuels, market terms like supply and demand, where the demand for energy is kind of this external, already existing need that is not further queried. And this is the notion of what is the economy is in this realm. So eco-Marxists and socialists, of course, have followed Marx to what he calls the hidden abode, which is production, the way that production feeds into exchange. And once we get to the realm of production, we open up further questions about how is property made private? How is labor conceived of as free, which also means not owning the means of production, extractive zones. And we're probably all familiar with these kinds of questions, and we too embrace them. Feminist Marxists and eco-feminists have pointed out that there are hidden abodes, or invisible conditions of possibility behind even the realm of production. And so here we draw on Nancy Fraser's work, and she thinks about three of these. One is the realm of social reproduction. So that is provisioning, care, things that are often put into the private sphere and feminized. The other is the earth itself. So the way that the earth is conceived of as a resource and a sink is actually a condition of possibility for all of these sort of market realms above. And finally, political power, or the state. So this is the way that what seems to be in the realm of exchange to some as a free market, or a realm that's different from politics, is actually structured by and made possible by law, militaries to protect that law, imperial formations. And what's interesting about all of these to us is how they are hidden. And so they have to be excavated. This helps us be more alert to the potential for renewable energy to be imperial and authoritarian. Scholars have highlighted how wind and solar can also be extractive, including Simone Howe, who studies wind energy in Mexico, those looking at lithium mining in Bolivia, or Karen Rignall and Sarah Reiser, who examine solar projects in North Africa, like the image on the left. In terms of the political dimension, what we want to highlight is that these projects are depoliticized, so that they are reduced to questions of price, development, or meeting pre-existing consumer needs. In Morocco, that is often meeting the needs of Europe. Questions of land ownership, of how much energy is consumed, how legal systems are set up to benefit investors, or the distribution of wealth are decided and settled in advance. So for example, Reiser studied one of the largest solar energy projects in the world, established by the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy through a public-private partnership. The land for this project was originally a commons for local Berber clans, and the project was justified by pricing that commons and then acquiring it. But the land first was undervalued by national elites, Reiser shows, in keeping with the common depiction of deserts, swamps, or mountainous regions as wastelands or underutilized terrains. It was also in keeping with a tendency to see commons and subsistence ways of life as in need of a certain kind of capitalist green development. Reiser describes how the process set up a gendered anti-political machine using the language of green development, women's rights, and climate mitigation in terms of supplying solar power to Europe to justify the solar development. This reveals how gender can be co-opted to legitimize imperial projects, and it's a prime example of why just adding women in solar panels doesn't guarantee energy justice. And that's the subtitle of our article, by the way, why adding women in solar panels isn't enough. Moroccan solar systems are depoliticized by deciding in advance what's possible and what feels realistic. That's why Fraser describes political power as a hidden abode. It's a condition of possibility for energy production, but is made invisible. In our own experience recently working for climate action at Virginia Tech, political demands are shut down by claims that they are unrealistic or not possible in the moment. But it's in the very deciding of what is open for change and what is on the table for discussion, most especially around property and asset ownership and decision-making structures. That's where the political happens. A feminist political vision thus goes far beyond putting women in positions of power at existing institutions. So one example of a feminist experiment in ecopolitics is underway in Syria by the Kurdish women's movement, who are practicing something that they call democratic confederalism. Democratic confederalism is drawing upon the writings of the Kurdish thinker Abdullah Öcalan, who in turn was partly inspired by Murray Bookchin and eco-socialist thought. Öcalan teaches that patriarchy and violence against women lie at the heart of state violence and ecological destruction. The Kurdish women's movement have put democratic confederalism into practice, including building an eco-village called Jinwar in Syria. Their practices of democratic confederalism are based upon three pillars. One is social ecology, one is women's liberation, and one is radical democracy. All of these pillars reflect overhauls of the three hidden abodes mentioned by Fraser, including valuing reproductive and care work. This movement shows that feminist energy politics will have to reach deep into the heart of how society is organized. They are experimenting with new forms of democratic decision-making and nested council structures, and they explicitly connect these with ecological well-being and dethroning patriarchal power. Tragically, though, this is also an experiment that has been under continuous threat from the surrounding war and state violence. Next, I will turn it to Shannon, who will go to the economic dimension of feminist energy.
Thank you, Cara. So as we conceptualize it, the economic dimension of a feminist energy system would prioritize human and more than human well-being and biodiversity over profit. It would refuse the growth imperative, would have a commitment to community economies, and a commitment to pink collar or care economy jobs. These priorities stem from research that has shown that gross domestic product, or GDP, is not an accurate measure of the well-being of a nation, because GDP doesn't account for levels of inequality, poverty, health, pollution, or educational attainment. In a similar vein, there's also an assumption that consumption is correlated with high levels of societal well-being, but this is also not supported by empirical research. New economic visions are often dismissed on the assumption that they demand sacrifice and discipline. Instead, feminists argue that the hegemonic ideology of GDP growth, correlated with energy growth, obscures alternative visions that would better serve people and the earth. Within a feminist energy system, what could an alternative vision for well-being beyond GDP look like? In our paper, we outline possibilities for economic changes that could simultaneously increase well-being and decrease energy consumption. So in the slides that follow, I'm going to discuss each of these that are listed on this slide here in turn. So the first possibility is a universal basic income. Feminism reminds us that not all people share societal benefits and burdens equally. Many people who live in rural fossil fuel extraction communities, such as the coal fields of Central Appalachia in the United States, and the oil and gas fields of the southeastern, northeastern, and western US contend with multiple intersecting forms of marginalization that make transitioning to a low-growth energy economy particularly difficult. Many extraction communities are monoeconomies by design, leaving few living wage job opportunities outside of fossil fuel companies. Moreover, the logic of capitalist production, which prioritizes technological advances and automation to increase productivity, leaves ever fewer jobs for an already underemployed population. As my co-presenter Cara Daggett contends, most arguments mobilized in favor of fossil fuels begin and end with jobs, arguments that are particularly compelling because work in the United States and elsewhere is so closely tied to notions of hegemonic masculinity and citizenship. She maintains that a universal basic income could liberate energy from work and appease the fears and anxieties associated with limits to growth arguments. Basic income pilot projects are taking place worldwide, including in US cities like Stockton, California, Santa Monica, California, and Jackson, Mississippi. And preliminary results from a basic income experiment in Finland show that those receiving basic income report higher levels of well-being, fewer health problems, and more confidence in their future prospects. Meanwhile, the basic income recipients had similar rates of employment as a control group composed of unemployed Finns who received only traditional unemployment benefits. In addition to a UBI, reorganizing work time into a shorter work week could also have ecological and social equity benefits. Decreasing working hours has been found to reduce energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, leading scholars and activists to propose shorter work weeks as a climate mitigation strategy. Although wage labor has been tightly connected to personal worth, as well as to hegemonic masculinity, feminists help us realize that there are many other activities, economic and otherwise, that could be more fulfilling and healthier for people, communities, and the ecosystems that sustain them. There's ample evidence, for instance, that the excessive working hours demanded by many blue and white collar industries make people unhappy and unhealthy, especially those working multiple jobs to sustain their families. Meanwhile, as Bull and Acosta argue, low carbon activities and leisure, including art, music, and social engagement, are associated with a triple dividend: low resource, socially beneficial, and individually satisfying. Alongside a shorter work week and a UBI, an important aspect of a new economy aligned with a feminist energy system is a higher valuation for caring, service, and regenerative labor, including everything from child and elder care to teaching, community building, artisanship, and environmental rehabilitation, which could include caring for brownfields and other polluted ecosystems, especially those where vulnerable populations live. In the case of Central Appalachia in the United States, for instance, this could mean providing government funding for grassroots initiatives to repurpose and rehabilitate former mountaintop removal coal mining sites into alternative uses. As you can see in the photo on the right of the slide, the so-called reclaimed mountaintop removal mining operation in this picture here has completely denuded the soil, leaving thousands of acres of barren land with little other than weeds growing on the surface. However, there are some creative but incredibly underfunded initiatives underway that could potentially thrive on these denuded lands with adequate support. One example is a small company called Hernshaw Farms, which runs a mushroom growing operation out of shipping containers on a former mountaintop removal mine site in West Virginia. The company sells mushroom grow kits online and gourmet mushrooms to restaurants, specialty shops, and local farmers markets. The mission of this small operation goes beyond growing and selling mushrooms to actually rehabilitating the soil on this former mining site. After a mushroom block flushes with fruiting bodies and the mushrooms are harvested, the company uses the spent blocks to make compost, which they add to the soil on site. Their hope is to gradually replenish the soil enough to grow crops, ultimately turning the mine land into farmland. Another innovative example is Appalachian Botanical Company, which is a 40-acre lavender farm and apiary located on a former mountaintop removal mine site in Boone County, West Virginia. Lavender is a crop that can actually thrive in the poor rocky soil that's left behind on these so-called reclaimed mountain top removal mining sites. The company grows the lavender and then distills the lavender it grows into essential oils that are used in the body care industry and in culinary products. Lavender also has the added benefit of removing heavy metals from contaminated soil as it grows. So propagating lavender on this former mining land helps in soil remediation. The business began in 2019 and employs 85 local residents, many of whom are out of work coal miners, people recovering from substance abuse, or formerly incarcerated individuals. With more than 1 million acres of land in central Appalachia that has been denuded by mountaintop removal mining, land, I will add, that was once home to some of the most biodiverse hardwood forests on Earth, initiatives that seek to empower local residents to rehabilitate the land should clearly be a priority. However, one of the many challenges is that this land is still owned by private companies. Even this lavender farm had to secure a 15-year agricultural lease from the coal company in order to build this business. We argue that land justice should also be prioritized in a feminist energy future. Former mine land that is currently concentrated in the hands of corporate landowners should become publicly owned and made available for restoration projects like lavender farms or mushroom farms, or for other uses that could be mutually beneficial to local communities and the environment. Reducing energy use need not mean austerity and suffering. What it means is shifting our priorities to relinquish the growth imperative and supporting initiatives that foster a culture of care for other humans and the more than human world. This means prioritizing not only environmental rehabilitation efforts, but also so-called pink collar care work jobs, decreasing the work week, and providing a universal basic income so that people have the freedom to pursue endeavors that improve the well-being and quality of life of Earth's inhabitants. New economic visions are often dismissed on the assumption that they demand sacrifice and discipline. Instead, feminists note that our existing economy does not serve people or the Earth well, and that the hegemonic ideology of GDP growth correlated to energy growth obscures alternative visions. Because feminists have categorized the breadth of hidden violence upon which growth relies, they are freer to imagine modes of well-being beyond the constraints of GDP and consumption. While wasteful and trivial kinds of commodity consumption will need to decrease, the focus should be on what can be increased as a result. In slowing energy consumption, we stand to gain in free time, justice, dignity, artisanship, community engagement, beauty, and rest, provided we are prepared to fight for such a feminist energy system. The next dimension of a feminist energy system that I'll discuss is the socio-ecological dimension, which acknowledges that energy systems are inherently violent and unjust. This dimension emphasizes that feminist energy systems should center ethics in energy system design and planning. What this means is making the full life cycle of fuel technologies transparent in order to support ongoing efforts to mitigate violence. Donna Haraway calls this staying with the trouble, which requires an honest look at the resources and labor that are needed to produce energy and acknowledges the unintended consequences of our energy choices. As noted earlier, renewable energy does not necessarily mean sustainable energy. A feminist energy system must name the injustices inherent in the life cycles of all types of energy production, not just fossil fuels. For instance, hazardous materials are used and generated in the process of manufacturing solar photovoltaic panels, and a large percentage of these PV panels are manufactured in global South nations, which have fewer environmental and worker safety regulations. The disposal of these panels after they've reached their usable lifespan, which is about 30 to 35 years, should also be of concern. As sociologist Dustin Mulvaney argues, there is a looming tidal wave of solar e-waste that will be dumped in global South nations if mandatory recycling programs are not put into place globally. A feminist energy system acknowledges these very serious problems and seeks to mitigate them. In other words, feminist technologies and energy systems seek accountability. Communities committed to a feminist approach to energy design and production will seek out energy sources whose life cycle can be traced, and will understand that energy systems are rarely contained in one city or even in one nation state. Anthropologist Miles Lennon imagines how this might look in the context of community-based Solarize campaigns, which are popular solar PV group purchasing efforts in the United States organized at the community level. In these campaigns, a group of residents in a geographic region come together to negotiate with solar installation contractors collectively for rooftop solar in order to secure wholesale prices. Since 2009, the Solarize model has spread across the United States, empowering marginalized communities to take the lead in securing renewable energy for their communities. However, as Lennon argues, these campaigns miss a tremendous opportunity to incorporate anti-racist and environmental justice considerations into their negotiation processes, so that the racialized sacrifice zones that are involved in solar panel production are considered in these negotiations. Lennon argues that this could easily happen during the request for proposals or RFP process, suggesting that co-pollutants and ethical considerations could be elements that solar contractors are asked to account for in their proposals. As he notes, an RFP could, for instance, require that all contractors who submit a proposal source their products from companies that adhere to the Solar Energy Industry Association's Solar Industry Environmental and Social Responsibility Commitment. Or they could insist that the solar manufacturers receive a sunny score from the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition's solar scorecard, which evaluates solar manufacturers based on 8 criteria, including extended producer responsibility for collecting and recycling end-of-life solar PV modules, emissions reporting of chemical and hazardous wastes and air pollutants, a formal commitment to worker rights, health, and safety, an enforceable commitment from their suppliers to protect workers and the environment across all tiers of the supply chain, reporting energy use and greenhouse gas emissions to a third party, reporting the volume of water used and wastewater generated, diligence in ensuring that the tin used in PV manufacturing does not contain conflict minerals, and minimizing the presence of toxic heavy metals and including a high level of recycled content in PV modules. In addition to mandating that their solar panels be sourced from the most ethical and environmentally conscious producers, and that those producers have recycling programs in place, communities might also seek to forge transnational relationships with the people in the solar supply chain to learn about the demands of local activists and workers who mined the minerals in their panels or who constructed their panels, and to mobilize politically to support them. So to summarize, the socio-ecological dimension of feminist energy systems requires that communities grapple with how best to address the hidden injustices associated with renewable energy production. When communities commit to staying with the trouble in this way, it may also drive them to develop solutions that reduce the overall demand for electricity in their communities, whether that be through increased energy efficiency, passive solar heating designs, geothermal heating and cooling, or other locally grown solutions. Next, I'm going to pass it on to Christine, who will talk about the technological dimension of feminist energy systems.
Thanks, Shannon. So our fourth and final dimension of feminist energy systems is the technological, which, as you can see here, we define in distributed, community-directed, collaborative, heterogeneous, and multiple terms. I'll speak about each of these throughout this section. The first point to make about technology is that it's more than what we see here. There's a tendency to define technology in digital, algorithmic, or even machinic terms, but STS scholars employ a more capacious definition, and it's the one that informs our thinking about feminist energy systems. For us, and following Aristotle's definition of techne, technology is any tool or action that seeks to close the gap between the world as it is and the new or desired world that technology calls into being. This definition renders many kinds of things technological, such as white supremacy or heteronormativity, and allows us to incorporate the concept of technology into our social movements and worlding practices. This more expansive definition of technology also allows us to multiply the scales at which particular tools can be the site of our politics. Earth movers and fracking fluid, for example, can be understood as technologies in the narrow sense, that is, as tools involved in the production of fossil fuels. But working with a broader definition of the term also allows us to analyze them in their world-making context as elements of broader processes of capital accumulation, imperialism, and racial gender formations. This broader definition of technology also invites us to understand feminism in these terms. For us, and following Donna Haraway, feminism constitutes a practical technology, that is, a dynamic and evolving cluster of concepts, practices, and tools that, rooted in yearning, work to enact social and political change. Feminists have long recognized the sociality of technology and have provided some of the earliest intersectional arguments regarding the complexity of technological relations. Feminist science studies scholars in particular focus on the mutually shaping relationship between gender and technology, in which technology is both a source and a consequence of gender relations. So to ground this a bit, I'm presenting you with three images. On the left, we see a bumper sticker spotted by Shannon several years ago on the truck of a regional pipeline worker. And you can see that it says, "Wine 'em, dine 'em, pipeline 'em." In the middle, we see an Indigenous woman at Standing Rock explicitly evoking tradition with clothing and other artifacts as part of her resistance to the North Dakota Access Pipeline. And on the right, we see a news story reporting higher rates of sexual violence experienced by Indigenous women in extractive regions in the United States. Though these figures are distinct from one another in important ways, feminist STS scholars note how they also function as cultural configurations, each helping us to grasp how gender, race, and energy technologies are profoundly entangled. Analyses like these extend the work of intersectional feminism by demonstrating that socio-technical systems reflect and participate in hegemonic modes of interlocking oppressions, and that actors embedded within these systems are themselves organized hierarchically. In short, power relations are frequently normalized and stabilized via how people do gender through technology. These insights are in line with feminist architecture, planning, and design, all of which have imagined and built communities that are not only more inclusive and livable, but also more sustainable, often with an emphasis on public transit and common green spaces. Because technology and infrastructure are integral to sealing relations of power, feminist designers recognize them as uniquely impactful fulcrums for social transformation. Indeed, the household and its consumption of energy and other commodities is a key site in energy studies. The reorganization of work and home, including how they are spatially related and their temporal rhythms, can loosen the grip of fossil fuel reliance and patriarchal power. And it can do so while opening up possibilities for post-carbon pleasure, where energy reduction is achieved through simultaneous energy reclamation and redirection. With the right planning and with support from built and social infrastructures, such energy reduction strategies may also correspond to the kinds of well-being just discussed by Shannon. Addressing this over 2 decades ago, Marxist feminist scholar Maria Mies proposed a recalibration of productivity, in which time is not segregated into portions of burdensome labor and supposed leisure, but in which times of work and times of rest are alternating and interspersed. Because needs will vary, communities can and should develop their own work, energy, rest rhythms. Distribution of energy would reflect a given community's priorities. Such systems can increase our capacity to live honestly with difference. Energy systems that honor variation and plurality resist the imperializing, colonizing, and xenophobic fears of difference associated with global monocultures and universalizing technologies. Energy systems that think difference differently are not designed with everyone in mind, nor do they interpolate specific and socially constructed constituent groups, such as women or racial minorities, as bounded and fixed kinds of people. In this image, we see a person struggling with a staircase, a technology designed to close the gap, as it were, between the underground level at which the subway deposited them and the life they desire to live on the street. A feminist approach to this technological problem notes the likelihood that a person with a stroller will be a feminized one, but resists imposing a totalizing meaning on who precisely needs a ramp. Thinking with disability scholars as just one example, feminists strive to define accessibility as expansively and inclusively as possible. At the same time, feminist analyses take note of the routine devaluation and subordination of femininity and feminine labor and energy expenditures. Though not characterized as the worst energy villains, clothing and hair dryers are often invoked as sites of individual behavior change, technologies that people can and therefore should use less frequently in order to reduce their energy footprint. What we want to stress here is that such changes in behavior can uniquely impact people who gender themselves in feminine terms, particularly if their professional or personal value is coded along these lines. Women judged more harshly on the aesthetics of their home and/or physical appearance are more likely to suffer, including economically, by dialing down the use of these particular technologies. Feminist energy systems then honor what STS scholars Pinch and Biker call interpretive flexibility, foregrounding how meaning, rather than being fixed, is interpreted and negotiated by those social groups connected to it. This image of an eco-village is standing in for the work of a graduate student named Angelica Wagström, with whom we've been recently collaborating and who is doing ethnographic fieldwork in an eco-village. The village that Wagström is studying prioritizes the use of technologies that allow residents to enact a specific human-nature relationship. That is, they focus on low-tech implements, slow modes of labor, and permaculture practices that minimize extraction and resource depletion. These practices constitute what Mies refers to as subsistence technologies, in that they respect the limits of nature and reject exploitative relations, including with the more than human world. The use of subsistence technologies aligns feminist energy systems and Wagström's eco-village with the degrowth and solidarity economy movements, both of which focus on the simultaneous crises of capitalist hyperconsumption and the finiteness of natural resources. Feminist energy systems are transparent and do not erase, sublimate, or displace the burdens that particular communities might be asked to bear. Organized intersectionally, they strive to respond to the multiple energy needs of a community and to generate energy worlds that may not yet have been imagined. Following Hurricane Maria, Resilient Power Puerto Rico began installing solar microgrids that are community controlled and that support key social infrastructure. Social experiments like this understand community grids as more than a mode of fuel provision. Redesigning fuel power goes hand in hand with reorienting public space and social power. Both RPP and the eco-village demonstrate how energy systems can connect rather than isolate users, increasing the intimacy and relationality between community members. In these exchanges, distinct energy users activate what philosopher Simone Bignall refers to as complex selves, through which heterogeneous differences compose interdependencies. When contoured to the multiple needs of heterogeneous pluralities, energy systems can generate collectivity, accountability, well-being, and even pleasure. Feminists recognize that such relations of interdependence are no more vulnerable or precarious than are the unstable and contingent networks of capitalism with which we are entangled. Foregrounding the mutuality of contingency and variation reminds us that corporate ownership of and dominance over energy systems is anything but natural. A commitment to plural energy systems is also a technologically sensible response to the stochastic and geographically limiting nature of some renewable energy sources. A feminist orientation to energy would center this variation and develop technologies that work with rather than against it. Indeed, planning for and around such variability need be no more labor intensive than is the often post hoc work of remediating the externalities, injuries, and inequities produced by fossil fuels. Feminist energy systems would center the technological challenge of planning around stochastic supply and shift the labor of aftermarket remediation, injury repair, and legal defense into designing systems that help to align energy and human variation. Two final examples will hopefully further illustrate this point. The first is this park in Lima, Peru, that I was fortunate enough to be able to view from my window when I stayed there several years ago. The park has welcomed a colony of feral cats and also houses many benches, picnic tables, and a large children's playscape. As I learned throughout my stay, the park stays lit well into the night, midnight, and beyond. making it safer and friendlier to families, cat lovers, or anyone wanting to enjoy some time in an outdoor commons. Any efforts to transition this park to a renewable source of energy must include input from these various stakeholders for whom keeping the lights on is a high priority. Alternatively, Shannon, Cara, and I live in a mountainous region of the eastern United States and are lucky enough to enjoy the evening appearance of fireflies for several of our summer months. This particular image is from a national park not too far from us, where fireflies synchronize for a few weeks every June. Many of the folks in our community, therefore, opt to spend their summer evenings in the dark so that we can better appreciate the wonder of these transient residents. Our point here is that technological design problems can only be solved if they are understood as such. Centralized systems leave many energy users underaware of how else they might power their lives and communities, as well as of the pleasures they might take in identifying and contributing to their local energy profile. And to wrap things up, we turn once again to Cara Daggett.
In this talk, we've tried to not only envision what a feminist energy system might look like, but also to answer the question, why feminism? And as I hope you've heard here, a feminist approach doesn't claim to be the only entry point to achieving justice and sustainability, and neither does feminism mean that gender and sexuality are the most important dimensions, nor that they operate in isolation from hierarchies of colonialism, race, class, or ability. However, a feminist approach does reveal that gender and sexuality have been integral to the propagation of extractive systems. It's impossible to understand extractivism without a feminist framework that recognizes how the feminization of care, reproduction, and the earth itself is used to legitimize ecocide. Much of our past work focused on exploring extractivism and its gendered dimensions. And so in this work, the project was to do the risky, it felt very risky thing of trying to think about the promise of a feminist imagination and describe it in more detail how feminist movements for liberation could help us imagine ecological justice. Much of what we have presented involves then imagining what that could be, and like the last slide, the future is feminism, but it draws upon what's already here too. Our sense is that feminist energy is already here. It's already here in the work of feminists worldwide who are leading resistance efforts, as with the women on the right from the Labuski Cree Nation and their solar campaign to provide power to land and water defenders blocking a pipeline in Canada. Or on the left, the work of women leading the resistance against the US-owned mine El Tabor in Guatemala. That's one kind of feminist energy that's already here, but feminist energy is also already here in multiple ideas and practices for living well and more sustainably, none of which is the single answer for everyone. The real work is not necessarily in inventing new ideas, new technologies, new systems then. Maybe the real work is in the struggle to get these already existing voices, practices, and experiences heard, to insist that they are indeed practical and possible. So many creative ideas for living better are stifled or destroyed in advance because they don't accord with the current systems of finance, property, and power. They are deemed as unrealistic, too small, too simple, or improbable. But what is unrealistic and improbable is that the status quo can deliver justice and sustainability with a few tweaks. Feminist energy is not a utopian project then, as we see it. Feminist energy systems would acknowledge that energy production is effortful. Rather than wishing away this labor, we strive to distribute it more equitably. Technological fantasies then that liberate humans from dull, dirty, and dangerous labor perpetuate the fiction of an autonomous subject whose freedom is only possible because racialized and gendered labor goes on propping it up. A dream of feminist energy doesn't imagine a world of free energy or little effort, but rather a world where freedom means self-development, the freedom to make art, to take care and be cared for, where the goal is not endless energy, but enough energy for these multiple human ends. For many earthlings, both human and not, feminist energy can bring hope, insisting that new and better worlds of energy are possible. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting. We've got some rounds of applause in the in emoji form here. I'm going to open it up for questions. Does anybody? There's nothing in the chat as of yet. Does anybody want to kick us off, or shall I go for the first one? Can't see any raised hands at present. Okay, maybe I'll take chair's prerogative and ask the first question. Hopefully by that point, people will have a few questions ready. Oh, we have got a question from Nikki. Nikki, do you want to jump ahead of me? Because
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Cool. Thank you very much. It was really interesting talk. I had a question literally today. One of the sort of leading energy suppliers in the UK called Octopus Energy has just announced that they're building a big pipeline to get cheap solar energy from Morocco. And I think Octopus are doing all sorts of really exciting, innovative things and are a leader in the UK compared to a lot of the other energy suppliers. But given what you've just said, I'm like, how as a feminist does one respond to that? I'd be interested to have your thoughts on that because it's just literally today.
I guess since that was my section, maybe I'll respond. Thank you. Well, because I don't know specifically about Octopus or what they're doing, I'll just speak in more general terms. I think how a feminist would respond would be to not in advance welcome a project on the basis of what kind of fuel it is, but have all of those further questions, some of which were outlined in Shannon's section about what were the terms of how the project was developed, and learning about and perhaps transnational solidarity with people in the places where these panels are being built, but also where the panels are coming from. And so, it's a complicated thing, because I think what we're not doing is we're not saying, oh, energy should just be local all the way down. I think we're acknowledging that these are, at least for the moment, going to be global systems. And so it really is a work of sometimes asking these questions that might feel slow. And I'm really inspired by Kyle Powys-White, who's an Indigenous scholar who notes that often Indigenous forms of resistance to green development are felt to be, they frustrate people, because it's like, well, this is very urgent. We have to do this now. And White's view is that it's the actual destruction of these kind of social and natural relations that made the problem. And so to continue to double down on them over and over again doesn't bode well. So I think as feminists, we're really interested in how do you repair relations.
Great response. Hopefully that answers your question, Nikki.
I would also just add that I think that, and this opens the article that this talk is organized around, that there's also this question of the promise of renewables to maintain current levels of energy consumption, right? And so I think there's this check that needs to be continually articulated about, okay, great, wow, now we have this pipeline to endless energy, and it's not endless. And so I think there's just that degrowth perspective that we would also articulate. I think that finds it that is present in the article, but is something that we're absolutely also in line with in this thinking.
Yeah, thanks all of you. And Christine, I think that was my immediate response, was around that, well, we can just carry on consuming forever.
Exactly.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions or raised hands here. So maybe we'll go Simone first and then Laura.
Thanks very much. Thanks for a lovely talk. It's really great to have all the different aspects laid out for us. I guess lots of questions, so I'm just going to choose one of the many things I thought would be interesting to discuss with you. One is about who one is speaking to. So obviously in this forum, I imagine you're largely speaking to the converted. So, you know, very sympathetic to your point of view, totally agree with the positions, etc. The difficulties I have are when it comes to talking to people who don't see this. You might I saw that article about the cable to Morocco around the Bay of Biscay. I thought it was a joke, actually. And I was really, really shocked when the discussion first came up in the European Union about, oh, well, we can just import solar energy from Morocco, as if they hadn't had any critique of colonialism over the past 50 years. But I see it as kind of intrinsic to a way of technological thinking, which is kind of predates everything else, or precedes all the other political or financial steps, where the problem is here, the answer is there, well, we just link them together, as if geography didn't matter. So on the one hand, there's a kind of an audience of retraining engineers to think about the colonial context of their thinking, which is quite a challenging thing to embark on. But even right at the other end, when you're, for example, I'm working with a firm at the moment that is developing an floating offshore scheme for ideally for poor coastal communities, and they approached us because they knew that there were lots of social issues that we would need to think about. And even then, it's really hard because there we're going to have to fight with the local or deal somehow with local kind of hierarchies of power and local regulatory officials who are not so keen. And so there's like, the principles are really clear, but actually trying to turn around what is such a deeply embedded system means that we might have to think of other ways of talking about it, because this kind of talk convinces us, but I think somehow there's got to be another kind of talk to convince the other people. Do you know what I mean? Sorry, it's not very well articulated, but it's like, how do we multiply this message into many different languages in a way that will give it some kind of political clout and move it on? Just a small challenge for this afternoon.
Yeah, we've struggled a little bit with this too, just having it called feminist energy systems, right? I mean, you know, we wanted to make sure that we were naming, you know, that this is really rooted in feminism, but on a practical level, certainly people who hear that are like, or some people who hear that are like, what does this have to do with us? And we have some colleagues in Hawaii who are working with a community Molokai. These are engineering students. Well, they're not students anymore, they've graduated. And they actually were able to adapt this feminist energy system framework and work with a community to convert it into an RFP process for this community that wanted to become self-sufficient with its energy production. And so they had the same struggle. Like they had to kind of change what they called it, you know, in order to move beyond that barrier of the name, which is part of the problem, you know, that we're trying to lay out here, that feminism isn't just about women. It's, you know, this is a whole sort of understanding of how power operates more broadly. There was something else that you said that I also wanted to touch on, and I've sort of lost it. Yeah, I don't know. It might come back to me. Cara, were you gonna?
Yeah, I might add too, in terms of audience. We were really audience was the first question we had as writing together. And we were trying to write to, I agree with you, a converted audience, but converted in the sense of excited about energy transition, and also sensing that justice is relevant and gender seems cool too, but very stuck in like not really understanding what that means. And we at our own university, which is full of engineers, Virginia Tech, continually come up against this thing of like engineers knowing they need to do justice and then thinking that's something they could just do pretty easily and it's not an expertise. And so part of this argument, part of this article was for us to lay out, if you want to do justice and you want to do gender, this is what that actually means. So in part it is, you're right, for an audience of us to say, to kind of like think it clearly and have it mapped out, but it's also an argument against the co-optation of justice in a very thin sense. And in terms of maybe we do need another talk for engineers, maybe you're right.
Well, and something else, now I've remembered what I was going to say, something that you said in the beginning about, you know, these engineers working, we need to convert them, but part of it is also the community. A lot of this has to be driven by communities saying, we want a different type of energy production. We want it to be decentralized. We want it to be, you know, we want to be in control of the RFP process. And so the example from Hawaii was so powerful to me because the community itself said, you know, we're sick and tired of having these high energy prices and also being, you know, a place where things are extracted from. And so we really want to have community ownership over this. And they took some of that power back, you know, through creating their RFP, and they incorporated cultural dimensions. Like part of the RFP was making the contractors talk about, you know, how this could influence the, you know, the problems it could cause for the cultural resources in the community. And so there's just, I think this ties into what Christine was talking about with technology not being a one size fits all, but it really needing to be, communities really need to be involved in this process of determining what's going to best serve them.
Yeah, and I would just add that, and at the risk of, you know, adding students or you know, thinking that my audience is students and academics who agree with me. So I'm really, this conversation is really important. But this semester, I have been teaching a class called Science, Technology, and the Environment, and it was a class that I inherited from someone else. And many of the students, again, as Cara said, many of our students are engineering oriented and technologically oriented. And so we began with this concept of techno-optimism and just critically evaluated it. And then, you know, before we went to thinking about energy technologies, water technologies, you know, thinking about the kinds of technological solutions to climate crises, we spent 6 weeks talking about racism and colonialism and feminism. And so when we came to the energy technologies themselves, they had a framework. Now, this is the first time I taught this class, and honestly, I'm not sure that I would have felt comfortable enough to have taught it in that way had I not been tenured and not had a little bit of my own security and power. So I think these questions are really, really vital and important. And you know, I think we all know that engineering schools are thinking very hard about how to inculcate some of these values into their educational practices and their and the plans of study for engineering students early on. But I think we all know that this is it's a very uneven situation. And so, yeah, I mean, we're right there with you with your concerns and questions.
Sorry, I think that quite nicely ties into Pascal's comment there as well in the chat that says, you know, of course, one of the challenges here is making feminist the universities that train these engineers. But yeah, Okay, we've got another question from Laura. If you fancy turning your camera on. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. And just to reiterate, it's really, I think both important. It's been a really interesting set of presentations, trying to put all these different pieces together, putting together, feminist STS with energy studies. We've got people doing energy justice. So thank you very much for kind of even just making this forum for us to talk and have the conversation. It's really fabulous to be part of it. So the question I want to sort of raise, and maybe connects to Simone's one as well, is that I'm very, very lucky to collaborate with communities off the north coast of Scotland in some islands archipelago called Orkney around their energy future. And it's very much kind of locally led activities, which is fantastic. Very similar perhaps to the Hawaiian example you gave. But, as I think you nicely reminded, these things are complicated. They're, even though the islands I work with and live in, are generating 120% of their electricity needs from renewables, a little bit locally generated, we can talk about all the issues about where the equipment comes from. It's not, somewhere ideal. So I wanted to raise this question and ask about when we're thinking about the cultures of care that we want to take in our collaborations with the people that we work with, whether it's communities of engineers or communities in islands or elsewhere. How can we think about the compromises that are going to be necessary in order to make things happen? And also to make things happen, given the fact that, there is an urgency to a lot of this work now, which I think we'd all agree on. So I would love to know if people have read interesting scholars who are thinking about this, who are kind of, how do we make, which compromises, how do we act as, we have this wonderful critical scholarship we can bring to our collaborators. A lot of the people I work with are engineers who are incredibly caring about, justice issues, fuel poverty issues, they get it. But they would love to have some support from the kind of critical scholarship that we have. But we can't critique everything and leave nothing. So I'm kind of thinking about how do we do that careful work of opening up the discussion, having with people, well, what do we add to the table? What do we hold back on, saying, okay, this is important? I would love to hear, ideas about scholarships, things I might read where people are doing this really careful, where we've got to make compromise in order to make practices. How do we not make sure that the same people are always being made silenced or made invisible and so forth? So we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so one piece that I will recommend, and is one that we talk about, I talked a little bit about in the presentation, is that article by Miles Lennon. I'll put it in the chat once I'm done talking, so I can't multitask. But where he's a cultural anthropologist, and he was the one that worked with the Solarize campaign, and he was working with Black communities in the United States that wanted to have solar and to take ownership over their, because they had seen these increasing energy prices. They wanted to be part of, finding a more sustainable solution. But he talks about the struggle that they really had in, it sort of devolved into just being about prices, right? And he then goes through well, what could a Solarize campaign that incorporates these justice dimensions and uses these tools? I don't know if I can share my screen, but that, one thing that I found really useful when talking with both communities, the sustainability coordinator for the town of Blacksburg, other engineers, are things that are sort of practical and give you some solid information to go on. So let me see if I can share my screen. Actually, Cara, can you put up that the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition solar scorecard? Are you able to get, I think it's slide 24.
It's going to take me a minute. So.
Okay, so I'll just start talking about it though. But this, every year, and actually they have not done it since 2019. So I'm not sure if COVID delayed them doing this again this year, but the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition every couple years would do a solar scorecard that ranks solar companies based on a variety of, I went over them very quickly, but a variety of justice and ethical elements, both in where the minerals are sourced, the worker conditions, but also whether they have these, recycling. And I know Europe is much better about the mandatory recycling of solar panels, but in the US, we don't have the mandatory programs. But it's, if you just Google it, the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, like I found that because it's like, okay, these are very quantifiable differences between these different solar manufacturing companies. And here are these elements that we should be thinking about with regard to the, inequalities and injustices that are inherent in the life cycle of solar production. And so like going back to that, trying to, stay with the trouble of going into this and really understand. And once people kind of see some of the hidden injustices embedded in solar production, I think that they're much more willing to try to say like, okay, well, maybe we do need to really try to see if we can pay a little bit more for this if we're going to go with a more ethical solar manufacturer. But the other piece of that is, is just really being honest about how it's not really possible to just replace one form of energy with another. Like in this so-called transition we're having, even if we bring on the same number of kilowatt hours of solar, it's not displacing that same number of units of fossil fuel electricity. It's not a one-to-one displacement. And so that understanding of that also helps people see, like, so it's not just about bringing on solar, but it's also about we truly do need to figure out ways that we are reducing our electricity or energy consumption overall. So I don't know if that partially answers your questions, but that's sort of like a nitty gritty. That's one. This scorecard is the way that I've gotten through with some of the engineers at Virginia Tech when we were talking about the climate action commitment and the university, doing solar and how you incorporate justice into thinking about that. They're like, oh, justice is too mushy. Like, how can you quantify that? But this is like, giving them some way to quantify it. And obviously there's much more to it, but it's a stepping point, into that conversation.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think that's the compromise, is that a lot of these examples that we mention are really not perfect and open to critique and not the one and all solution, including the scorecard. And that's why I would say the work of critique is never ending. And I also think it's okay. I think we just need a lot of people doing a lot of different things. And I think there is a role for some people who are just critiquing everything, because we have these stepping stones, like Shannon said, and they're not like, they're stepping stones to the next thing. So if we don't keep critiquing, we don't keep keep transforming. So for some of us, we might be more interested in working hand in hand with communities and coming up with like these stepping stones. And for others in our academic world, their role might be more the voice of the critic who's constantly alerting us to why this is not enough. And so I think sometimes, especially for feminists, people get kind of exhausted, like the eye roll of, oh my God, please stop and just let us do something without critiquing it. I just want to really emphasize that that's an important role, as annoying as it gets.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I would also add, I think there's a third route that's been discussed, which is about, what comes after critique. I think about Donna Haraway's work on diffraction, forms of intervention. So I think that it's not a kind of binary and absolute thing. Critique is also, there are ways of doing it that can be very, very generative and really important. So thanks.
Great, thank you. We've got another question from Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for an amazing presentation. I work in the area of food politics. And so when I saw the solar scorecard, it's like so similar to agricultural system scorecards. And I was also really interested in this idea of subsistence and subsistence technology. And obviously thinking about food, we think about subsistence as well. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk about sort of the tension between this default to calculation, like food miles and these kinds of sorts of calculations that we also saw in the solar scorecard, and the idea of subsistence, leaving it really kind of open, but I'm really kind of interested in calculation and how it anchors us and pins us down quite a bit into sort of really narrow places when we're talking about politics. Thanks so much. Really appreciate this.
I have very little to add to your question, because I think your question is already a really important and amazing insight, and I'm grateful that you've already given it to me to think with. And just for me, the first word that came to mind, which is just this concept of enough, right? And how we meet calculations and scorecards and quantification with some kind of feminist or otherwise justice concept, robust concept of enough, right? And how do we develop that? And I think that actually feels like a partial answer to what Laura was talking about as well. This, it's sort of how do we really develop enough, and how do we talk about it in more, how do we quantify enough, or how do we make enough translatable across disciplines, perhaps, so that people, so that we can think about it in some of these ways that I think we're trying to articulate in this work. I don't have anything else to add yet, but I'm so grateful for this provocation.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important question. And also, I mean, my sort of response to that is, yeah, I mean, the solar scorecard and quantification is, like I said, stepping stones for the people to help get them to that point. But like the work of really needs to happen within communities, in social deliberations. And I think that I didn't talk about this in the talk because I was trying to figure out what to include, but I kind of wish I had now. But in our paper, we draw on feminist economic geographers, J.K. Gibson Graham, and the way that what they call, community economies built on ethical action. And so they put forward 4 ethical coordinates in their economic foundations, and those include these deliberations that could happen within small communities of identifying the collective energy needs and determining how those needs could be met equitably, acknowledging how much of that energy that's produced is surplus to our needs, and deciding how that surplus should be distributed to improve community well-being, determining the resources that will be consumed in the production of energy, to develop a plan for consuming those resources sustainably and equitably, and to work to protect, renew, and expand the commons so that collective natural energy resources can be sustained for future generations. And that deliberative work goes back to what Cara was saying at the conclusion about the need to slow down. And like, it's really hard though, like the scorecards are efficient, and they're like, for these, for the engineers or whoever who are just like, just tell me which companies, like the bad ones, so we don't buy from them, you give them that. But the work that actually needs to be done is the more deliberative process where, you're saying, deciding how much energy do we actually need, and moving beyond this idea that we need to continue expanding energy, when what actually needs to happen is we need to decide where we're going to cap it, so that we understand that like this is not a resource that we can continue expanding within planetary limits. It's just, it's not possible no matter how many solar panels we bring on. So anyway, so thank you for your question. I think like what that really gets at is just how this really needs to be a slow process, but there's so many tensions with that, because that's not what people want, and that's not what people say because we're facing a climate emergency. So, it's a difficult question.
And I just, Sarah, you probably know about this work already, but I just put a couple of books in the chat. Michelle Murphy's, yeah, and then Diane Nelson's book. Yeah, so I'm sure you know them, but for folks who are also interested and don't know this work, they're both really great.
Thank you. That's great. We've got about 5 minutes left. So does anybody have any additional questions here? In the absence of one, I might ask a quick question. You've taken most of my questions already, guys. So thanks. You got me just thinking about kind of the role of kind of creative forms of expression, such as writing, artwork, poetry, fiction, and so on. When you're talking about kind of having different, how do we speak to people beyond the academy in different ways? And it reminded me of kind of the work that's being done around solar punk. I don't know whether you've come across it, but it's kind of this emerging genre of fiction based upon these ideas of trying to imagine futures that are more ecologically and socially caring and kind of restorative in many ways. Firstly, I wanted to kind of, if you'd given much thought to the role of kind of creative arts and media as a way of kind of communicating some of these messages on different levels. And secondly, are there, beyond art and these kinds of creative expression, are there any other registers that you think would be productive for us to be exploring in order to create these changes?
Cara, do you want to talk about William Morris's vision for the arts and crafts movement in the Victorian era? I feel like that is a really neat connection.
Oh yeah, well, that's fun. It's funny because the solar punk, I'm not that familiar with it, but I'm guessing I've heard of it. I just haven't read a lot of it yet. But I'm guessing it's a variation on steampunk, and so William Morris is like from this same 19th century world, not steampunk though. I thank you for that question. I'm really interested in the arts, creativity, certainly. And this is why Shannon's mentioning, I've always been intrigued by people like the work around the arts and crafts movement, because there was an emphasis on that the vision was about beauty and about making art as, and it kind of goes along with Walter Benjamin's notion of, fascism aestheticizes politics, and the goal is to politicize art. And of course, everyone can still have an interesting discussion about what that means. But I think, for me, a feminist energy system or a just and sustainable way of life will be centered on art making, as everything from an orchard is making art to, art and beauty really a central practice that's acknowledged. And so that's a little different though than saying, thinking about how art can be a tool for change. And, sometimes that can be a little heavy-handed, but I'm excited to look at Laura Watts. Laura, you posted in the chat that you have a book where you've really featured a lot of that. So that would be good to look at. And I think a lot of my work has been about a discomfort with the way that, at least until about 10 years ago, a lot of the existing ways of thinking about climate and ecology were very dystopian and very morbid and or very kind of hyper masculinized. So it's exciting to see, like even the artwork that I ended with, it's exciting to see more generative, creative, and different genres coming maybe Laura can speak to it better. It seems like you probably know more than I do about new experiments.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important topic, and there's so much going on, and I don't know the half of it. So please, other people jump in, because it's so exciting, the various range of kind of arts, sci-arts practice in relation to energy and energy infrastructures. So I just pointed to the book Energy Worlds and Experiments, which I was really honoured to edit with Britt Ross-Winterreich and James Maguire in IT University of Copenhagen. And we've got graphic novel in there and all sorts of we experimented with different ways of writing and how that makes different kind of energy worlds. So this is building on the kind of, I think, the point you're sort of making, and the kinds of ways that we write about, the kind of choices we make in our both written practice or visual practice has an ontological effect, right? I think that's very much in what Donna Haraway has often been talking about. So that book's an example. I was lucky enough to work with colleagues around an energy walk, which I gave a video link to. And I've also been looking at energy and poetry, and how poetry as a particular form of what could be academic writing also helps us think through and create different kind of energy worlds. So, and I think that absolutely, it doesn't so much, that work doesn't so much connect with the kind of like arts and crafts movement per se, although that's a really nice, I think interesting issue. I think it's more connected to the feminist kind of like commitment to how do we make interventions. So I think about work that's being done by people like Kat Yudnikul, who's also edited a book called Transmissions, people like Norcha Mars, who's also been writing about different kinds of inventive methods. So I think there's lots to say and lots of fantastic stuff out there, and I think that, exactly as you say, thinking about how that enables us to create different kinds of energy worlds of the future, because by thinking about what can we do on the page and how does that create new ways of having conversations with people is really important. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing to think through.
Yeah, and that's so great. And I just put something else in the chat, which is just a center at Arizona State University here in the US, which is a center that puts science fiction writers in conversation with STEM professors and academics. And so, and the writers go for short residencies, and they're generating a lot of really interesting work from there as well, with this very intentional, and it's got an academic focus, but it's a super interesting space.
Thank you. That was really, really great, really interesting. We are out of time, unfortunately, which is sad, but it's been a fantastic discussion, and I really thank everyone for their contributions, and particularly our speakers. Just a reminder, this will be made available soon online on our YouTube channel and on our website. So if you're eager to watch it twice, or if there was something that you missed, please kind of find it there. We'll also be circulating things or kind of letting you know when it's available over our email and Twitter accounts. Without much further ado, I'd like to say thank you again, Shannon, Cara, and Christine. It's been lovely hearing you speak, and we look forward to hearing more about how your work progresses in the future. So thank you all.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you
Thank
so
you all.
much.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.